once asked my father if he worried about things. He seemed very calm about everything, which was annoying. And he went away for a couple days and he thought about it. And he came back and he said, I don't worry about things, because in life, the really important moments, the things that change your life forever, are never the ones you can think about or plan for. They just happen. And if you can't think about them or anticipate them, what are you worrying about? So that made a lot of sense to me. And that anecdote, I think, says a little bit about my father. He's somebody who would take your question seriously. He would think about it, and he would give you a reasoned explanation for it. He was a really brilliant man. He was the youngest child of an immigrant Armenian family and the only one born in the country. I think, like a lot of immigrant stories, that child that's born in the country of an immigrant family tends to become something of a caregiver for the rest of the family and spokesperson for it. And I know that was definitely true for him. He was from that generation that's famously silent about their accomplishments. And so a lot of what I know about him came from a few anecdotes that friends would tell me. I knew, for instance, that he got straight A's from kindergarten through his doctoral work at Brown University in applied mathematics. I knew he spoke 7 languages, although not from him, because he wouldn't tell me those things. If you've ever seen the show The Marvelous Miss Maisel, the father in that show is an applied mathematician in the early 50s, and his dream occupation is to get hired by Bell Labs. My father was an applied mathematician in the early 50s, and he was recruited by Bell Labs to go work there as his first job out of college. So that gives you some idea of what we were dealing with. My life is very different. Nobody would confuse us. I like to think of the metaphor of boats. So my father was definitely a motorboat. He had power, and he had focus, and he had drive, and he had destinations. He was going places, getting things done, and everything worked. Like, he never experienced failure as far as I could tell. I was more of a sailboat. I had to work with the tides and the winds and all this kind of stuff, and back and forth. Nothing was a straight line. It's always tacking back and forth, which got more complicated because I actually never had a destination. It was more just about sailing around, looking at things. My life didn't have a focus really until my wife Kelly and I were expecting our first child, a son that we would call Anthony, after my father. So as we were expecting, waiting for Anthony, we got some really devastating news that my mother had ovarian cancer. And so fortunately, I think they caught it very early, and the prognosis was really good and positive, and she started her treatments basically at the same time as Kelly's pregnancy was progressing. And by the time Anthony was born, her treatments had stopped, and everything seemed to be going as well as could be expected with her. And as far as Anthony, I just remember holding him for the first time, and he looked at me with this little smirk on his face that was, it reminded me of a grandparent who is up to no good with a grandchild, and they're giving me that mischievous little look in their eye, a little twinkle in their eye. And I thought, something's going on here. He knows something I don't know, and he's only been here for 4 minutes. So. Anyways, so the first year, passed, and at his first birthday, my mother was in remission, and Anthony was doing well. There was a couple minor concerns about sort of meeting growth measurements and things like that. But everything seemed to be fine. In the months that followed, our concerns kind of deepened around Anthony. He stopped gaining weight and some things like that. So we started a process of investigating what was going on, starting with the easy things like diet and so forth. As the months passed, though, the kinds of things that we were testing for were more and more serious. And by his second birthday, it was down to a handful of incurable, untreatable terminal disorders. And we also learned on his second birthday that my mother's cancer had come back, and it was much more serious this time. So going forward, my mother was starting her treatment again. There were surgeries and chemo and all of that, and our process of trying to diagnose Anthony continued. And as part of that, I was holding him one point, and he was getting some blood drawn. He was about 2.5, and he looked up at me with his little lip quivering, and he's like, why do that to me? And I had to think about it, and honestly, I didn't know. does it really matter what it's called? Yeah, it would be helpful, I suppose, to know. But the real thing was, are we inadvertently telling him that we're not happy with who he is? Because he has a genetic disorder. His genetics are just as much a part of him as the color of his hair. And we didn't want to be telling him that somehow we were disapproving of who he was and all of that. So we decided, Kelly and I, that we were going to shift our focus and just dedicate ourselves to giving him whatever the best version of his life it could possibly be. And on the side, we would pursue whatever the diagnosis was. A couple months later, we did get him diagnosed, and he ends up having metachromatic leukodystrophy, which is a genetic disorder that basically dissolves your nervous system over time. Doctor said he might live to 4. So, and my mother's condition at the same time was also worsening. A few months following Anthony's diagnosis, the doctors actually told my mother that she may have, a month or 2 left. So Kelly, Anthony, and I moved in with my parents to take care of my mother, and to take care of Anthony, and to take care of my father, who by this time was not dealing and not able to deal with what was happening with my mother. It was out of his scope of things he could fix, and that was a brand new experience for him. So he was angry, he was in denial, he was drinking, he was lashing out at people. It was a really difficult period of time. On the eve of Anthony's 3rd birthday, as I was putting him to bed, he looked up at the sky and pointed at the stars and he said, "Nana, go home that way." So, anyways, the next day on his birthday, she passed away. And I think, in the truest sense of understanding, he might have been the only person who really got it, like what was going on. If my father was a motorboat and I was a sailboat, I think Anthony was a starship, because he was like off this planet and somewhere. He understood things beyond the things that we can see and understand. And he would actually talk to her. He would see her in corners of rooms, and he would wave to her, and he would laugh, and they would have a conversation, and then he would tell us what she was saying. And he did that until he lost the ability to speak. The month following my mother's death was not good for my father, wasn't good for any of us, but particularly for him. I think he was nurturing his anger and his resentment and his alcohol. And then on 4th of July at 5 o'clock, he called me over and he said that I had caused the stress in my mother's life that had given her the cancer. And he wanted, in honor of Independence Day, he wanted a clean break and sever all ties with us, and he wanted us out of the house immediately. So we grabbed Anthony and a few little belongings and we left and stayed with friends for a week or so until Kelly's mother offered to take us in. And during that time, Anthony was sort of rapidly losing abilities, and that was hard to watch. By October, we had found our own apartment, and we were in there, and Anthony had a new brother, Sam. So that was great. But on the other hand, his body was really starting to waste away, and he spent most of his time in a little red wagon that we would pull him around in, and he would go everywhere in his little red wagon, and or on the couch propped up from pillows because he couldn't really sit up by himself. By the time Anthony was 4, he only weighed 14 pounds. He was on hospice care. He'd lost the ability to speak. He was having difficulty swallowing. And every night we said goodbye instead of good night. And then something in him changed, and that little smirk, that mischievous grin reappeared. And in a glorious act of biological defiance, he lived for 10 more years. And he never spoke again, but he could smile and he could laugh and he could understand what was happening. And he was constantly entertained by his brother Sam and his sister Madison and his other sibling Tony. And together we tried to build the most normal life that we could possibly live. There were, obviously moments of crisis and all that stuff, but by and large, it was kind of a magical time for all of us, 10 years that we never thought we would have. When Anthony finally did pass away, 5 days short of his 15th birthday, during the funeral, my son Sam, who was 11 at the time, interrupted and said, I have a speech. And apparently he'd been sitting in the pew writing a speech, and he got up and he gave this beautiful eulogy about his brother and about how he was his hero, and he had taught him courage and compassion, and that taking care of each other was the most important thing. It really is true. I think that the things in life that really affect us and build our life are the things that are out of our control and out of our anticipation. I think my father was right about that. It took me a long time to process my feelings around my father. Following that 4th of July, except for a couple of handful of brief encounters, I never saw him again, and he died suddenly several years later. And I was thinking about it, and in my mind I was thinking that he was struggling from an inability to cope with things that were out of his control because he'd never experienced something that was out of his control. And I think that is a part of it, but I don't think that was the key part. When I look back at his life, I realized that none of the things that he did or excelled at were things that he even really took pride in. Like, he never talked about it. He would almost sort of ignore it if people brought it up. His real thing was that, and I think it comes from his immigrant background, was to take care of things, to take care of the family, to be the problem solver, to be the one that could get things done and make sure people were safe. And that extended to our family as well. And I think that was his identity. And so I believe what happened to him is that when he couldn't fix the problem with my mother, it shattered his identity. And that was something he couldn't cope with. And my regret is that he wouldn't let me help him in that moment, because I was ready to take that on. Because the thing that we had in common really was our willingness and our eagerness and our drive to take care of those that we loved. And I wanted to be there for him, and he couldn't accept that. My hope is that when I inevitably fall short and don't have any answers, that I have the courage to allow my children to help me, because I know they're ready for it. I'm Dave Corharian. Thank you for listening to my story.